Alright, so for the neck, I was talking with Kevin and we thought we'd play around with the coloring a little bit more. Do more of a fade burst with some of the different colors. So what I'm going to do is leave this yellow, but I'm going to wrap some of the tans around to give it a little bit of a different hue. So I'm going to darken up the neck with the English tan, which was sort of a dark red. I'm going to sand some of this back and come back with like a brownish and just sort of get this yellow. So we'll do this last yellow and then we'll hit suntan and another dye to get a different color scheme going for the neck, just because we can. So what I'm going to do here is actually fret this after I'm done coloring it and staining it. That way I get the coloring all the way up inside the frets and it looks like one solid piece. I haven't done that before, but we're going to experiment because I can always clean out the frets like I did before. So we're going to start with some English tan. This color is outstanding. It's interesting in this figuring is that as you get around to this side, it just slightly dies out. And this is what's great about the way I made the neck, is it's all glued on, the figure runs consistently through. You cannot tell that it's glued. It's a real unique look. Like we did in the stain videos, you always want to go with 2 coats. Evens out the coloring. Shows you where you need a little bit more work. I thought the truss rod hole would give me a little bit of trouble, but I sanded that down with 220. And then 320. We'll just wipe that in. So we'll put another coat on the back. So that's 2 coats. And like I said, we got a little bit of creative freedom. We're going to darken up the center here with some ox blood. I could already see that this is picking up all that red. So I'm just going to use this to fade it in slightly. We're going to carry it up here slightly. You can see that red really soaked in here. So we want to make sure that we pull it like that. So that looks killer. We're going to grab a little bit of dark brown and run it in the center. Just like that. Then we'll come back with the English tan. Because now I've got red and brown. We'll sort of clean this up on the back. And then we'll come back with ox blood. And just stripe alongside the brown, because you can see where the brown stripe was. Come back with the tan. Brown, ox blood, and English tan. You can see that heavy line make sure we get that really heavy brown line, red line, and then the tan line. You can see the different coloring from top to back. What's great about sanding some of this back is you'll get a really cool scheme. Trick is just not to overdo it and keep your rags clean, or else you're gonna get a little brown there. Just clean it up like that. So that is dark. That looks cool. We're gonna come back with a clean rag. Sort of fade this all in for good measure. You can see how much color comes up. We're just going to leave it because we're going to sand next and get it cleaned up, so you can see the difference in the color schemes. And this was intentional, because once I hit this with a little bit of yellow, it should pop pretty significantly, and I can get all that color coming around, which is what we were going for when we talked on the phone. So I'm actually going to clamp this down so it doesn't move. Pretty happy with the way this is looking. Just going to pull a little bit of that color up. You got that heavy line. Once I come back with the clean color, it should clean that up. So let this sit for 24 hours, come back and see what we can do. So we'll get the sandpaper out, and we're going to go ahead and sand this off a little bit. Again, we'll stay with 320 or 600 grit, depending on how much I want to get out. And it looks like I'm working with 320 here. And what's key in doing this is keeping the sandpaper clean. The color is going to build up, and so you got to wipe the sandpaper clean versus just rubbing in the color then that you've just sanded off. So a lot of sanding back and forth to get this coloring right. So then we'll sand the actual fretboard as well. Try and get that color out. So here we'll go back with the sanding block and making sure that I get the coloring even. You can see all the colors back and forth, clean it up, make sure it's not loading up too much. Alright, so we're going to come back with some yellow here. So I've got my old yellow rag from the body. And we're going to make it pop here. And that is awesome. You can see how much darker the coloring does. And just this side didn't have as much figure. But having that darker brown and red actually looks really cool. A little more yellow. I love how I took that brown and sort of ran it up here. And that is an outstanding look. And so I had a little brown spot that's showing up from before. I'm okay with that. I think I may want to just run a little brown down the center. Oh, we'll see what he says. And I put on new gloves because I knew once I started rubbing this on it was going to cause a big mess. I didn't want too much brown. I'd say probably the only frustration I have is the figure not running through here. At least that's the bottom side. But I may have to add a little bit of brown just to match the strength of the figure on this side. So while the neck looked cool,
it didn't really match the body too much. And so I noticed that red from the original color is really sitting in as I was sanding this back. And so what I did is I got some neutral, and I used the neutral to help pull out the color. So instead of sanding and sanding and sanding, wanted to pull out more of that red. And it actually became quite an issue as I went back and forth with Kevin on what he wanted it to look like. So we used the neutral, and you can see how much color I'm actually pulling out, but yet that red pigment is really sitting in, which is causing an issue as I go through this rest of the video. So once we pull all that color out, I get some 320 grit sandpaper, and we start sanding it again. So sanding it down to pull out more color. And this is where you want to test on scrap. Probably should have tested and tried to get it to match first. But we had so much fun going back and forth, we just figured it would sort of just match up, and that wasn't the case. So we'll sand down again once more here. Get the neck as colorless as we can, but you can still see sort of that red tinge sitting in. We'll get it cleaned up, vacuum all this up, make sure I got all the nooks and crannies clear. And we're going to come back with some dark brown and see if we can cover up that red. So I've got my old application pad from the body, and we're going to apply the dark brown on top and cover up some of that red. And actually this looks pretty cool at this point as well. I think if we were going back and forth, we may have just left it, but we got way too color happy and kept going back and forth here and trying to figure out what we wanted to do. So with the dark brown and the figuring, it looked really neat, but it still didn't really match the body all that great. So we'll come back with some steel wool, and what he wanted to do was have the fretboard a bit lighter and then have the back darker. And since we used the black fret markers, it really was hard to figure out what we were looking at from the front. So again, we went back and forth with a lot of different color. I'll pull out some of the brown here, but you still couldn't see the fret markers. So if we had white fret markers, it would have been okay, but with the black, you just couldn't see it. So we sanded a little bit of this off, got it nice and cleaned up, and began to add a little bit more color just to get it to pop. So we left the headstock at this point just dark. Figure I would get to that later. So as we went back and forth, started to add a little bit more color once I sanded this back. I didn't add the yellow and it didn't pop as well. So I ended up sanding that down once more, trying to get this to match, but we were okay with it not being perfect. And this was with a couple coats of true oil. We still didn't like it, so what we did is we sanded down and added more yellow, and that got it to be a lot closer. So this is sanded down with the beam. And then I added a little bit of yellow and brown on the side just to give it a little bit of a different look. So it's close but not perfect. I think this is the classic example of testing on scrap. But we're pretty happy with the way this looked out. It wasn't a perfect match, and we weren't looking for it to be perfect. We wanted it to look a little bit different. So remember, always test on some scrap. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll show you more videos coming up here shortly on this completed guitar.